Welcome to Target Free Thursday Nights at the Walker Art Center. My name is Sarah Peters. I direct public programs here, and I want to thank you all for coming out to look at some beautiful images on such a cold evening. I also want to let you know, in case you don't, that Thursday night is your weekly opportunity to experience all that the Walker has to offer for free. Gallery admission is free every Thursday night from 5 to 9 p.m., and there's usually some sort of talk or tour or educational experience happening. So pick up a calendar on your way out tonight and come back and visit us again. Tonight, we are honored to hear from one of the Twin Cities' most vulnerable artists, the photographer JoAnn Verburgs. The occasion for her appearance here tonight is the recent opening of the exhibition Present Tense, Photographs by JoAnn Verburgs, that currently occupies the Friedman Gallery upstairs. The images in this show transform the gallery walls into a contemplative space in which one is prompted to ponder the big questions. Ideas such as the constraints and freedoms of representing time, the nature of human interaction, the gaze, and the often performative relationship between artist and subject. Verburg navigates all of these questions with a grace afforded to her by a keen eye and impeccable technical skill. In fact, in our increasingly digital age, where images are captured and transferred via cell phone, some might say that Verburg is keeping it real by photographing on film with a large format camera that she tows around the world. Using this historic tool, she engages with photography's most classic subjects, the portrait, the landscape, and the still life, and infuses them with a contemporary edge. It is exciting to welcome JoAnn back to the Walker stage because it is here that she began an important relationship to photography and performance by taking pictures of Walker performing artists in the 1980s. And if you haven't had a chance to see the exhibition yet, there is an important historical document in the show that's also screening outside this evening in the orientation area, which is her documentation of the commission of the knee plays from the 1980s, which is a really wonderful thing to have come back and show here at the Walker several decades after it was first produced. JoAnn is joined in conversation this evening by two of the curators who are responsible for making 30 years of her work accessible to us through this exhibition, and for that we thank them. They are Susan Kismaric, a curator in the Department of Photography at the Museum of Modern Art and the organizer of Present Tense, and Siri Engberg, a consulting curator for the Walker who worked with Verburg to hang the show here. And they will occupy the living room section of the stage this evening for conversations on all things photographic after JoAnn takes the podium and will give us a visual tour of her work. I also want to let you know that we are webcasting the program this evening, which means we're live on the web. And that also means that when we get to the Q&A session at the end, I ask that you use the microphones that ushers will have on either side of the house to ask your questions. And that way your questions get recorded in the archive of this program and we can all hear you. So, and please stand up when asking your questions so the people on stage can see you. I also want to mention another opportunity that you have to hear JoAnn talk about her work, and that is a gallery talk that she will be doing with her friend and fellow artist Ping Chong in March, on Sunday, March 9th, and there will be more information about that forthcoming in the next issue of the Walker magazine, so make a mental note of that. And I also want to say that if you aren't able to afford one of JoAnn's photographs for yourself, the exhibition is accompanied by a beautiful catalog with an excellent essay by Susan Kismaric that is available in the shop, along with some postcards of JoAnn's images and what I understand to be posters that are coming still. So check that out. The shop is open late tonight as well. So with that, please welcome JoAnn Verburgs.
Thank you, Sarah Peters, for inviting me. And thank you, I can't see you anymore, but thank you. You're still there, right? Thank you, all of you, for coming tonight. This talk is going to be webcast. As far as I know, it's the first event I've ever been part of that will be available in that way, so that, say, 104 years from now, someone sitting at a desk at work or at home in bed, in any city, any small town, any country, can open up a computer, if there is such a thing as a computer, but I prefer to think that they'll look at the ring and have little earrings with headphones in them, can actually experience a recording of our time and space here tonight together in their present tense, in the future. It's this that photography gives us, and film and video and recorded live music. This possibility, this mysterious ability to carry a time and space from one person to another. And it's part of what drew me originally to photography, as opposed to painting and sculpture. I'd like to make some thanks. First, Jim Moore, my beloved everyman in my photographs, who wrote this poem that speaks to what is the heart of, I think, his work and my work, and all of those of us who cannot be artists. Thank you, Jim Moore. I know you're out there. Saw you. How to close the great distance between people. Do it over coffee, like fish that appear to be talking, but are really eating to stay alive. I'm indebted to Susan Kismaric for taking a risk on my work. It was not an easy show to produce. My work is unwieldy, and it was a huge project for her to look at. She said everything. I didn't quite show her everything, but it was a lot of work in my studio. And by doing that, and then she had the challenge of coming up with a coherent selection. Just to give you a sense of the challenge, my photographs are not particularly about their subject matter, which can be almost anything, and that makes it harder to organize it into a show or describe it. And if you can't describe it, you can't pitch it. And I tend to work on several things at once, at least 3 at any given time, so there isn't an obvious linear chronology to follow to sequence the work in the galleries. For example, many of you are familiar with the giant glass collage that you saw in process, the process of installing it when you were walking in. The same month that I was working on that, I might have made a videotape of windshield wipers and also a portrait of my husband sleeping. Multiply that by a few decades, and it's a big, overwhelming mess. Susan cut through the chaos in my studio and collected examples from about half of my bodies of work that, surprisingly to me, she ended up combining into a coherent experience for the viewer. I love her seriousness about photography and her funny side, and I'm grateful really beyond words for this experience. I moved to Minneapolis in 1981 to get away from my burnout life on the East Coast, where I'd been working for 10 years. I was sent a notice by Rick Sfera of a visiting artist position at MCAD, a 1-year job. I looked up Minnesota on the map in my atlas, and it was buried in the gutter of the book, and I thought it would be a good place to hide. So I came here for a year to do photography. The work I did that first year here in Minneapolis introduces this Walker Minneapolis version of the show that Susan chose for the Museum of Modern Art. It was the first work I had made that needed to be up on a wall in order to be seen, and so it was necessary for me to think about exhibiting it for the first time as opposed to making work that could be shown on somebody's lap or on a table. Showing here at the Walker is in many ways coming a full circle for me. These pictures were made here. I've shown them in various places around the country, but it feels different this time. I know there have been many, many people who have made this Walker Show possible, and I'm very grateful for all of your voices, for all of your support, even though I don't know all the details of the story, the backstory, how it happened, or who exactly did exactly what. But I especially want to thank Siri Engberg, who emailed Susan that she wanted to bring my show to the Walker here, where I live, and Siri kept bugging Susan until it happened. Like Susan, Siri has a magnificent eye, and it is a pure pleasure, Siri, to work with you. I'm going to cry. Siri is also astonishingly articulate. I'm not, and again, I feel that words just don't get the job done adequately. To thank you for your great, graceful, welcoming way that you've organized the show and treated me and the beautiful way you've hung it. Now the sound should be off. Can you hear the sound? I think I can just hear it here. Good. It's been a real pleasure to work with two talented, smart women on this show. It's been a unique experience for me to see a show of my work a second time in a second place. And I want to especially thank Glenn Lowry and Olga Vizo for their leadership at two of the places in the world that consistently make it possible to see contemporary art. That is, art that's being made at the same time, the same present tense moment, as the culture from which that art comes. In other words, the museum allows for a reciprocal relationship, fresh and potentially meaningful, between people who use these two institutions and contemporary living artists' voices, so that MoMA and Walker can be including artists and including the community. Connecting the two, which I believe, along with schools and hospitals, is one of the most important roles any institution can have. So Olga and Glenn, I wish the Walker and MoMA good health. I'd like to shift gears now and add back in a few of the many, many works that got subtracted in order for you to have this coherent experience I was talking about a moment ago. And while I'm at it, I should just say that I would like to acknowledge that probably a lot of people in this room are wondering how the hell I got a show at the Museum of Modern Art and then the Walker, and I am wondering the same thing myself. And I still wonder if I literally still wonder sometimes when I wake up, did this really happen? So I can't really answer that question. But what I'll do with slides that we're going to shift over to is try to give you a sense of the context within which the photos and videos in the exhibition sit. So now we're going to shift to slides, please. The dramatic opening of the curtain. I'm going to do a quick march through the chronology of my work and mention a lot of the artists, not obviously all of them, or I would be here talking to you about art that I love and writing that I love and movies that I love all night, and I was not given that privilege. But anyway, on the left, just to start out with somebody, is a painting by Matisse, and on the right, a photograph of mine from an early 35 millimeter black and white photograph of mine. That was from my early days as an adult when I was learning about traveling by myself all over the country, hitchhiking, etc. all over America, and I think what happens when you travel is you learn about another way. We were talking about this on the radio this morning. It enlarges your life. It's a way of bringing another version of life, another understanding into your own experience. So in that sense, it sort of doubles your life or multiplies your life, which I think is part of what's reflected in the structure of these two images, the Matisse on the left with that vertical line separating, and on the right, if you recognize where you are in that picture, you're inside a car, looking outside of the car, and the structure is sort of similar in some ways, using a vertical, although it's a diagonal, to separate two different kinds of men. The one that I was driving across the country with, who I'd just met the day we started out, and the guy at the gas station. So it's a way of finding a formal device to add complexity to monocular image, the one lens, the one moment image of reality. Another early body of work, there are about 20 of these that I like, was creating an alternate reality. This was a reality underwater where gravity doesn't exist in the same way that it does up here where I am, where you are seated, but seems to be going in working in a different way, sideways sometimes, and slower. This is a blue reality. It's a quiet reality. So in that sense, I would say those pictures are metaphors along with whatever else they are. Diane Arbus's monograph cover on the left, another kind of doubling of reality. A lot of my early photographs include other images, or including this one of my sister holding two photographs of myself. And although I work very intuitively, I don't think about this stuff when I'm shooting at all. Looking back at this picture, I think there is, again, this impulse to work with a very simple medium to state something that has to do with the fact that there is more than one way to look at everything. And I think, that is what photography is doing. I said it earlier, it's doubling time, doubling space. Alexei Bradovich on the left, and another example from a different body of work. This was from a series of 8x10 color photographs that I made as contact prints for several years. And I paired these two images not only because I was looking at Bradovich around the same time I was shooting these 8x10 color prints, color negative photographs, but also because of the obvious structural similarity to the pictures I was just talking about, and how it works. Interior, exterior on the right, as well as the reflection, like a photograph, doubling of reality again. And backstage, in front of stage, in the Bradovich piece on the left. Working with the 8x10 is a very slow process, and for me it's continued to be a slow process, and I like that about it. Unlike chopsticks, which I thought, hey, I'm going to lose some weight, I'm going to use chopsticks, and it'll make me eat slower. Didn't work out at all. After the third meal, I was whipping down the food just as quickly as I could with a fork. However, I really love the time in Johannes Vermeer's paintings. And when I lived in Cambridge, when I was shooting these 8x10 pictures, I used to go over the Gardner Museum and sit in front of the painting on the left. It was stolen. This is a reproduction of it. And I joke with people, someday somebody's going to actually tap me on the shoulder and say, may I look in your basement? Because I love this painting. I used to go over and just sit and look at it. I would lose track of time and then leave. And I think what I got from it, I call Vermeer time. And what I mean by that is that the process of sitting and looking at the painting in terms of the time and the feeling you have doing it seems parallel to the process of sitting and listening to a music lesson. So there's a way in which I think the viewer's time in relation to the subject matter can be parallel to what you would feel like if you were standing and looking, or sitting and looking at the subject matter if you were in space with that stuff. Speaking somewhat more pedantically and technically, one of the things I was figuring out at the time I was doing these 8x10 color photographs was how to use my camera. And I'm not going to do a lot of tech talk, partly because to me it's merely a means to an end. It's not at all the end in itself. But people ask me a lot about the focus in the pictures. I hope these slides are in focus. Can you tell? Can somebody tell me if they are? Are they in focus? Yes? Okay. Then I can explain about the swings and tilts of the camera. I work with a view camera, and that means it's a large camera on a tripod with a bellows. On the front is the lens, on the back is the film, and the bellows is actually flexible. That's the point of the bellows. It can move back and forth like this, but it can also twist. If I do what's called a tilt, which means this or this, with the back part of the camera, or a swing like this with the back part of the camera, I can actually change the shape to some extent of what I'm seeing in the ground glass when I have the dark cloth over my head. And that's how I got that bowl to look like a circle. That's why it's not receding into space more than it is. And I had seen a picture of a garden at the Cooper, what's it called? The Cooper Hewitt Museum in New York. And I was interested in the fact that the garden receded in space, but for some reason the artist had chosen to make a fountain into a vertical plane in the image, a circle. And I don't know why, I was just intrigued by that. So I tried it myself. And that was one of many. It's an easy one to show you and explain, it's a good example for that. On the right, I'm moving, swinging and tilting, the same words, the front of the camera where the lens is. And what that controls, there's a little of each in each, but what that controls is the focus. And that allowed me, in this case, where I didn't want the white chair to draw your attention, so I was able to throw it out of focus and instead focus the green chair in the foreground, which is darker, and I knew that it wouldn't compete with the other things that I want your eye to catch first. And then put her face in focus, and then put that rock that's the wall of the interior space where she's standing in focus, so that it's like, I think of a lot of painters, including Joan Snyder, who I was looking at a lot at the time because I'd met her through her husband, who was a photographer, Larry Fink. And she would do these really very, very fine, detailed parts of a painting, and then she'd use very broad brushstrokes in other parts of the painting, and I really liked the effect. She's certainly not the only person, but she was someone I liked the work of very much at that time. So again, the swings and tilts would allow me to, it's not that I'm trying to control the viewer, but I'm trying to emphasize certain parts of the picture differently. And that's it on the tech talk. That's all you get. Okay. Ellen Manchester, Mark Klett, and I sat in my kitchen in Rochester, New York, at a time when I was really sick of working at the Eastman House. The people there were driving me crazy. Anybody who's ever worked in a museum has probably had a moment like this. And we came up with an idea that had originally been Ellen's idea, and Mark and I helped her flesh it out, to go to central Colorado and rephotograph sites that had been photographed in the 19th century by William Henry Jackson, Timothy O'Sullivan, and other 19th century photographers who had carried their gigantic equipment around the territories, what were then territories and are now states like Colorado, in order to make pictures of those places to bring back to the government, which resided in the East Coast, so that it would help fulfill what was considered the manifest destiny of this country to own all the property from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. And these would be examples of what the places looked like that would be added to the United States territory. So what we did was we took copy prints into the field, and it was sometimes extremely difficult to find these places. For one thing, the photographs were 104 years old. But just to, why did I include the Jim Melchert photo? Can you read it, by the way? I'm going to have to walk over there because I can't read it either.
3 lakes connected by a common horizon line.
Thank you. 3 lakes connected by a common horizon line. Ellen's interest was the picture, the idea that if you stand in a certain place, you're going to get the iconic picture. Mark's, I'm way oversimplifying. Mark's interest was geology and how the world had changed. They're both much more complex people than I'm drawing them as right now. And mine was more the conceptual side of it. What does it mean if you can make someone else's photograph? What does that say about photography as art? If I could go out to the to Colorado and make the exact same photograph that William Henry Jackson had made, could mine be art if his is art? Could his be art if I can make it again? Those kinds of things. And also, what is the tethering between the image and reality? If I went to a place where I was familiar with the image, but I'd never seen what the image is of, what would that feel like? What would that tell me? How would that feed into my understanding of this medium that I was really hooked on? So the picture on the left was shot by William Henry Jackson, 104 years before the one on the right. We waited for the exact time of day because the shadows would match, and if they didn't match, when you saw the 2 photographs, you would think the place had changed. You'd think the rocks had changed. In fact, in this case, it had been cloudy and there were no shadows, and then this happened a surprising number of times, and it makes me wonder if that's what caused him to use the same moment in time 104 years earlier as well. There'd be these cloudy, cloudy, cloudy days, and then suddenly the clouds would part. It would be exactly the right time to take the picture, and then we'd be socked in again. It was really amazing. Because my experience of the place was so different from what the photographs suggested about the place, I felt that as documents they were fraudulent. To the right and the left of what we photographed, there were things like, somebody listening to a radio that was playing Jerry Jeff Walker's song, "Take This Job and Shove It," and then you look at the 2 pictures and they look so similar. So there's a sense it was so profoundly a lesson in how the photograph is tethered to, but not the same as what it's of. Here's another example. This is a 104-year diptych. The group shot on the left with me in the front, taking the picture, self-portrait with my pals who went to the survey site to do a film, connected with a copy print of the William Henry Jackson photograph from 104 years earlier. We used Polaroid film. We had to do that project because, again, I don't want to get into the technical stuff too much, but we needed to be able to see the image at the site. And we worked out our methodology using an image and an image rather than just the place and an image. And so that got me connected with Polaroid because they were a sponsor of ours. They gave us free film. And one thing led to another, and they ended up hiring me to do a visiting artist program for Polaroid with their new experimental camera that made instant 20 by 24 photographs. And those of you who saw Chuck Close's self-portrait show that Siri and a curator from San Francisco, MoMA, did not too long ago, it was about a couple years, 3 years ago, however long, 2005. saw his work from that same program, which is how I got to know him. And while I was at it, working with these other artists, I also snuck in a few of my own photographs, which I had to say to the Polaroid people who were very uptight about this. I had to do lighting tests. So these were my lighting, this is my lighting test of Andy Warhol. And it was really quite well, I could tell you so many stories about Polaroid. But let me just say, one of the really amazing things was when you'd go to the cabinet, anyone who's worked in a corporation, you know, you go to the cabinet to get your letterhead stationery or to get your pencils or whatever, and there would be boxes of SX70 film and cameras in there for anyone to take. So I would go get my SX70 film, and that was partly how I stayed sane, because the job was an incredibly intense, very, very, very full-time job. And the other way was to use the 8x10 material that they made, which helped me also in my job with the artists who were using the 20x24, because it was the same materials. So on the left, one of my favorite portraits of David Goldie's, and on the right, my sister, two of my favorite people to photograph over the years. And I also just want to mention that it was very typical of me to use various media simultaneously, not just stick with the 8x10 color negative, but to also use Polaroid, and also I was making little stereos with the SX70 that would fit in a stereo viewer, and you know, they don't really work as slides, I didn't include them. Various other things, black and white. So for me, that's a very comfortable way for me to work and draw, and I write in my journal and various other things as well. But around this time, someone in Cambridge who worked at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum said, we're going to get rid of the 11x14 camera that we have that was originally used to photograph the artworks in the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum collection. He said, "You're the only person I know who might be crazy enough to want to use this camera. Would you like it?" And I said, "Absolutely, sure." And then I moved here. I did one diptych in Cambridge and then moved here with it packed up in my little Vega with all my worldly possessions. And the rest of the story is where the exhibition begins that Susan chose with these photographs that were shown at Minneapolis College of Art and Design, where I had been offered a one-year visiting artist position and lived for a few months in the home of Frank Golke when he was teaching at Yale for a semester, and then moved into the home of someone I'd never met named Nigel Redden, who was the curator of dance and performance at Walker in those days. And he had just bought a big house and he was fixing it up, and he had a lot of extra rooms, and I rented a room from him, and I met. I think it was this same weekend. For some reason, the 24th of January sticks in my mind. I might be wrong, but I think it was this exact date. Tricia Brown Company came to do a presentation at Walker, and I knew nothing about dance and this very exciting experimental dance and performance going on at that time. And listening to the performers talk, the dancers in this case, along with experiencing my first winter here, it was fascinating. They would say things like, "Well, I think we should change something at the bridge." And I hadn't even realized there's a structure to a dance that someone has thought out in advance. So anyway, it was a fabulous experience for me. And I decided to use my 11x14 camera to make what I was also teaching at Minneapolis College of Art and Design and working with students. And I came up with a strategy that was sort of like a yearbook portrait image where people would essentially dominate a frame. But because I just moved here and I was really feeling this strange thing having to do with identity, which is whereas in Cambridge, I had been thought of as the Polaroid lady. Here, I was teaching, and I was a visiting artist, and if I wanted to, I could just, people would say, well, what do you do? And I could say, I'm an artist, and nobody would question me. So it's a very strange, slippery sense of identity that fed into this work as well, where I wanted to give the idea that who you are, what your identity is partly about these permeable boundaries between people. These are photographs of a piece I did with Maria Cheng and Patrick Scully, Wendy Morris, and Judith Miras. This is a piece that I did with Trisha Brown and her company. And I drew it out on a blackboard in my studio over at Minneapolis College of Art and Design, and knew where I wanted them to look, the different angles, which I think I know I was very interested in Frans Hals, the Dutch painter who does these big group shots of guys with the big giant collars on, the white collars and the black outfits. I was really interested in the way they were all looking in different directions in those paintings, and it felt almost cubist to me. It really gave each one, I thought, a sense of being an individual, not just part of a group, but also part of a group, but then also having his own, I think they were all men, his own unique attention, which gets back to some of the things I was saying about doubling reality earlier. So again, there's a sense of the yearbook style image, just a fairly straightforward ID photo, almost like your driver's license, but manipulated by, placed in the context of other people who then determine who these folks are. Each of us determines. We're all in it together. Some spin-off projects. I'm going to show selections of 3 spin-off projects from the heads. One was a series of photographs that I did of Jim Dine, and he, in turn, was drawing me. The drawings are now at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, and they also bought my first version of this piece that I made. But I had met him, Kathy Halbreich and I worked together at the Hayden Gallery at MIT, bringing in the camera and artists who then could be watched by the public for an hour a day, making art with this big camera. So having met him then, he suggested the idea. He came out and he saw my show of the heads at MCAD, and he suggested doing something where I would be photographing him while he was drawing, so we did this collaboration. Wherever it's in focus, he or the drawing is life-size. And one of the things I liked about this was that sometimes it seemed like the drawing was the permanent thing, and he was just this ghost almost rushing back and forth in front of it so quickly you almost couldn't see him. And then other times it seemed like he was the permanent solid thing, and the drawings were just being morphed. He'd throw a bucket of water on a drawing, he would take a big sander and sand it, and in all different kinds of ways abuse the paper. Another spin-off, I think, was, in retrospect, influenced by having met and fallen in love with Jim Moore, who I lived with, and it was the first time I'd actually lived with anybody, and I realized later that I think it was just so shocking to be lying in bed and open my eyes, and 6 inches away there's this person. And I think that came out in my obsession for a while with photographing heads and enlarging them quite big. Including Susan writes beautifully in the catalog about this piece. I could never say anything interesting as that, so you just have to read it in the catalog. Right around the same time, here's another version of Big Heads that's in the show. We were invited to join our dear friends. This is called Among the Unknowns because we were also invited to join people we didn't know to spend a week together. And out of that trip, which was actually the honeymoon of the people we knew, I made this piece called Among the Unknowns. And the other side of the unknown, the other major unknown, was that this was, Jim and I joked that this was our trial honeymoon because we had decided to get married, so that's very scary. Worked out. Okay, I'm going to change gears now. Bonnie Morris. This isn't exactly chronological at this point. But as I said, I work in a lot of different bodies of work at the same time. Wendy Morris. It's one of a series of hot springs swimming pieces. I'm not going to speak too much about these because I don't want to take up all the rest of our time. It seemed important to start out with more talking, and now I'd like to go through the images more quickly. But please hold questions for later if you have any about this work. This piece is called Dancer, Danger, and it was shown in a narrow, long gallery, very similar to the one where the Red Room here at Walker. Where you had to, but in this case even more narrow and longer, and you had to make, as a viewer, you had to make a choice to look at either the cutout photographs that I had two-sided taped, I think that's how I did it, to the wall, or either that or glued. I think they're two-sided, yes, they're two-sided taped to the wall. And I used a knife to make what essentially looks like a drawing line to cut them. And they're from little tiny bits of 35 millimeter negatives, so when they're blown up, they look pointillist. They've got like all the grain is gigantic. And they're thrown off color, which I felt would give a dynamism that I wanted to that wall. The energy for me feels like throwing something splat. On the right are, I'm going to move to the next two slides because you can see that, no, I made a mistake. I thought I had detail. Oh, I think I do, but they're after. Anyway, on the right are the people behind the scenes who were the very established, well-known people in their fields who did the knee plays, who made the knee plays. And on the left, you're seeing the people who were actually presenting it with their bodies on stage. I work very intuitively, and all these things that I'm telling you are all after the fact. I can look back and try to make statements about things, but at the time, when I'm shooting, I'm really just not thinking. The best thing I can do is not think, and yet that doesn't mean that I'm not trying to soak in everything I can. I think artists are sponges, and we take in, and then it's like you squeeze out a lot of it, and whatever's left over is the art. In this case, I want to just mention the experience of watching the people who were these famous people on the right in that last slide, working with the dancers in the splat energy wall. In this case, Robert Wilson, who was paid a cajillion dollars to, probably, I guess he was, to do his 13.5-hour presentation for the LA Olympics. And the part that was done here at Walker was the little entr'actes that would have been done in the final LA version as they changed the scenery for the big acts that were done in Japan and Milan and I forget where else. So what was really, the right eye-opening, I suppose, was watching how Robert Wilson really ultimately the reciprocity between these two kinds of, the administrator or the director and the person who was really raw material, the dancer, or he had some acrobats and some just pedestrians off the street, basically. And he could only do as much as he could communicate to them and that they could do for him. And that was really interesting to me, that no matter what brilliant idea he could come up with, unless he could set it on a real person who could do it in real life, it didn't mean anything. So where was the power? You know, was it in the idea people, or was it in the folks who were coming up on stage? And I was very interested in that reciprocity and the structure of the gallery I was just talking about, where the viewer comes in and has to make a choice, I think reflects that. Collaboration and installation, I think you can read between the lines, were getting to be more and more important to me. Here's the snapshot from which one of these dancer details was taken. And these are in the exhibition. A shot from right there in this room, and the people behind the scenes again. Okay, totally changing gears again. I work a lot in a journal. I oftentimes draw in it or put photographs in it. And those oftentimes become sketches for other works that I do with my 5x7 or in some other medium or some other year. And this is an example on the left of a detail of a diptych that I did on a train when Jim was sick, but I couldn't get it out of my mind. Something about that was very powerful to me. And on the right is another photograph that was made at the same time on the same trip. But I think that little snapshot evolved into, hundreds of photographs of Jim sleeping. People, my favorite, I have to tell you this. It might have been somebody who's here. You should tell me if it was you, because I love this. I love this story. Somebody saw an exhibition of my work that included a number of photographs of Jim sleeping over at Robert Thompson Gallery, and said to me afterwards, I felt like I should be really quiet so I didn't wake him up. I want to say something about scale. When I worked at Polaroid, those the things that the Andy Warhol picture and the things that the other portraits I made were my first life-size photographs. They're not life-size as in 6 feet tall, but they're life-size in the sense that the scale of some part of the subject matter is the same scale as it is in the world. So that was something that I continued to do again and again and again over the years. And it started by a portrait that I put up in my living room, and I couldn't stop looking at it, and I kept thinking, what is it about this? It was life-size. And I thought, if Joel were sitting here, if I were fixing dinner for him, I could easily walk into the kitchen, fix dinner, and it wouldn't be unusual at all. It would just seem totally normal. I couldn't go into the other room. I was just absolutely incapable of doing it. I had to just keep sitting there looking at this picture. So there was something very powerful to me about that, and I've continued using life-size scale, not in every single piece I make, but in many. And I'll tell you another little story, which is I needed to figure out what life-size was for this piece, this diptych called Bruce Twice. So I asked my friend Bruce if he could send me a Xerox of himself. And he was had just moved to Spoleto, Italy, and the only Xerox machine he could find was in the train station. It was a very old Xerox machine, as so many pieces of equipment in Italy are. And Bruce tells the story of going to the Xerox machine and laying his head down like this, and it moves, so he had to go. So then with the Xerox, I took a slide of my proof, enlarged it so that I could see what the right size should be, and then made the print the same size as my measurements. So that's how I do that. This piece is called Among the Unknowns. My mother used to say, "Why do you always go back to Spoleto every year? And, why don't you go someplace new?" But for me, it's helpful to go back again and again, whether it's Jim or another friend or another relative or a place, and rephotograph. This was the first of the photographs that included the newspaper in this conscious way that I continue to do and have continued to do and am still doing. The only rule I have is that it has to be that day's newspaper. I like the idea that what's in the paper that you can read is simultaneously more or less happening with the other subject matter, whatever's happening. Like this is called Ceausescu Nap, and the article that you can read in the paper is about the execution of the dictator in Romania, Ceausescu, and you are presented that with the nap of Jim. I'm going to read. I'm going to read this. I'm going to read this thing. This is Michael. Jim, those of you who talk about negative capability, which comes a gift from the world of literature. When man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. I want to bring that in at this moment because I think there's such a discrepancy or a difference between, and this is what we as humans can take in, and it's part of our responsibility as humans, but it's just a necessity that we have too, which is things like learning about poverty and racism and all the things that we hate about our culture, at the same time appreciating beauty. And that these things are things that we as humans take in together. They happen simultaneously, and we exist with them in time, the same time. This one's called Still Life with Serial Killers. Jeffrey Dahmer and Charlie Manson, in counterpoint with details of iconographic women by Gauguin, Manet, Seurat, and Renoir, going from right to left. This one's called News Captiva. Over here, Secret South Bronx. Secrets Iraq. So you can read about the Iraq War at the same time. The beautiful light is coming through your coffee cup and you're sitting at your table. I also think that, at least for me, I have very strong political feelings, and I think a lot of my political opinions and attitudes have come not from the moments when I'm protesting the war so much as when I'm reading the paper, I'm alone, I'm in a contemplative mood. So this kitchen table idea, or putting together a lyrical moment with a difficult learning moment, seems apt to me. Miles' Soldiers on the left. Movies Don't Cause Crime. Sacred Conversation. I'm going to change gears a little bit, again, just to give you a context for the gym wall, which was done at Parts Gallery, now called MCP, Minnesota Center for Photography. And I guess the only thing I want to say about this, it's a kind of a collage, and a lot of my work comes out of a collage impulse, whether it's a still life or an actual literal collage or something like this, an installation. But having to do with the past. If you think about something like a relationship that you have with another person, I'll use my relationship with Jim as an example. You don't necessarily, you don't think about it linearly. You don't look back and think, well, this thing happened on March 7th, and then March 8th something else happened, and he looked a little different on March 9th. But the whole thing exists in your memory simultaneously in the present moment. And that's of interest to me, and I think photography is a great vehicle for that kind of aspect of reality and of life. In the collage on the left, you can see in his reflection, he's seated as opposed to standing. And here, there are various points on a trip. There's the moment when someone's looking at a postcard of the place and giving directions. There's the driver, details of the driver. They're the two people falling asleep in the back seat. A different kind of collage, Poet Underwater, 4-part polyptych made with 4 negatives. As opposed to a straight photograph collaging the shadow with the image of the cloud with the hair in the foreground and the water, of course. Giardini diptych. Wallet. Underground. And I put these in just to put a foot in the door of the fact that in making this a coherent show, one of the things was which pictures will look good together, which pictures will read well together for a viewer. And all the photographs of, pretty much all the photographs of other people were edited out, which doesn't mean I don't still like them, including my beloved niece with her beloved friend who lives here and is actually here tonight. Thank you for coming. And I have truly enjoyed photographing the two of them over the years and hope to continue to do that as long as we're all alive. And that one's called Limbs, my niece. And finally, almost finally, some of the tree photographs that are not in the show and a couple that are. These were the first. These two were shot in the blasting heat of Italy, afternoon, summer light. And then Tango Tango. And this one that's in the show, and I just want to mention that the details for me, I'm showing details of the piece, the individual panels. Partly the way I think about these is they should all have validity as individual photographs. And that, I think, comes from the Isabella Stewart Gardner hours, looking at Japanese and Chinese screens. The MIA has some really beautiful ones as well. And each screen within one of these accordions of images has a different reality from the one next to it, but it's putting it all together that I think is, where my interest lies. And another version is sort of splitting it all apart again. I had the privilege of showing this work at the Institute in the MAEP gallery, and part of that exhibition included a stack of, it was a catalog. It was a one-page catalog with a full-size reproduction on one side, so it was like a poster, and on the back was the catalog text, and it was free and available for people to take. And I really liked the idea that these would just be going out like carrier pigeons. But then I've also been asking people, please, if you could possibly, this is after 3 days, we tried to make enough that we could give them away endlessly, but they were very popular. If you have one up in your house, would you please make a slide or a digital snapshot of it for me so I can show it like this? Because I think it's really fun to see what happened to them, the carrier pigeons landing in other people's houses. This is part of the same show at the Institute. And finally, I just wanted to make the comment, bring it full circle back to the little video you were watching when you first came in, seating yourselves, that there is a lot left out, and I'm not going to make you look at any more pictures, including this. This is the computer image on the left, because it's really hard to see what it is that you're actually looking at, because this is transparent glass, and you're looking through it at what's not included in that image. So that's what's in the actual image at the Mill City Museum, this 14-foot by 25-foot collage of glass embedded images. And on the right, what it looks like sort of in situ. So that is the end of part 1, not counting Sarah's introduction. And Susan and Siri and I will now be saying something very brilliant about my work, right? That's the plan, right? And then you get to ask questions. Thank you so much for coming.
Us yet?
That's mine.
Is it turned on?
I think
Yes,
we're
it's
on.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Hi.
And if we could turn the lights down just a tad and the house up just a tad. Okay. Well, let's see. Okay. And then if we could have the first slide up, please. Well, thank you all for coming tonight. Thanks to both of you for being here. It's great to have this opportunity to talk to both of you at the same time about the exhibition. I'd actually like to begin by asking Susan a question, if I may. And JoAnn saying, I wonder how my show got to be at the Museum of Modern Art and at the Walker Art Center. I'd love to just hear from Susan a bit more about MoMA's history with JoAnn's work and what drew you to do the exhibition, and how all of that came together for you and for the museum.
Well, up until very recently, the Department of Photography had a very generous program in terms of looking at work by artists, meaning we would look at the work of anyone who would care to show it to us. And we did that on a weekly basis. And I think JoAnn had heard of John Cherkowski, who was the director of the department from the late 1960s until around 1999. In any case, and it was recommended that she bring her work to the museum. So I was at the museum then, and I think it was 1982. So is that right? Yeah.
That sounds right.
Yeah. So JoAnn's out here working in Minneapolis or wherever. She's making her pictures, and she brought her work in '82, and then would periodically, as she finished a new series, which might be every 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, something like that, bring a new body of work for us to see. And it turns out that over the years, we would inevitably acquire a piece from the series. So we've been well aware of JoAnn's work since the early '80s. And the truth is, Peter Glassi and I, who's the current director, we tried to launch a series of books called Contemporaries, and we published 2 books in the early 1990s, I think it was the early 90s. One on Judith Joy Ross and one on Philip Lord de Corsia, who, your photo students, you may be aware of their work. In any case, JoAnn was kind of on the short list to do a book of the work, because you've had representation in New York, but in fact the work is not very well known around the country. So we wanted to publish a small book. In any case, the series failed. No one bought them. They weren't distributed, et cetera, et cetera. But Peter and I felt very adamant about bringing the work forth. And so the notion of doing an exhibition had sort of been on the back burner for maybe 5 or 6 years, something like that.
So does that mean if you had done the book, I wouldn't have had the show?
Possibly.
I'm so glad it failed. Thankfully.
But now you had both. Now we ended with the book and the show. But the thing that engaged us, I think, is obviously it's the work itself. And I don't think that there's any other work that I've seen that's quite like it. And I think one of the reasons that the work was always fascinating is because it is this kind of hybrid between straight photography and a more conceptual way of working. And it has to do with what JoAnn described about her experience in terms of performance and dance, et cetera, a kind of more conceptual approach, and yet a real appreciation of photographic history. And there's a kind of joining of those two things in a way that makes for very original photographs. So that's how it came to be.
We're actually looking now at one of, as JoAnn mentioned earlier, one of those first images made here in Minnesota. And as you also mentioned, many of those first pictures were taken of performers here on this stage at the Walker, which we chose to actually open the exhibition here at the Walker with that body of work because of that connection, and also because it's an early project of yours. But I'm wondering if you can talk a bit more about that idea, that moment you had when you first pinned a life-size head to a wall, an image of a portrait. And that sort of immersion that one immediately feels when looking at some of these. I mean, you'll notice when you're walking through the show that these heads are hung at life size or at eye level, and there is this immediate connection that the viewer has to the picture as a body standing in that room and looking at that picture. And there's a real sense of participation instantly on this end from the part of the viewer. So I wonder if you can talk about that. That idea, you said once that I think this sums it up quite well, the viewer should feel a part of rather than apart from your images. Right. And I think that applies not only to this body of work, but also to the landscapes, to many of the still lifes. I mean, there's a real vantage point that is very important for you, the physical body, looking at these pictures. And if you could address
Sometimes,
that.
I mean, I change my mind about this a lot, so don't hold me to it, but one of the things I think is a thread in my work is just how close can you get to somebody else? How much can you feel someone else's existence? And how much can you really know the way they look at things? And I think, it's just the two people. If there were only two people, how close can you get? And I think the photograph is a sort of a surrogate experience. Looking at a photograph is a surrogate experience of that. And it has to do with trying to come up with some specific strategies, picture-making strategies, for blurring the boundaries between what's in the photograph, which is, in the case of the portrait, standing in for a person. In the case of the landscape work, standing in for a place. How much can you create a parallel experience to the human present moment of feeling vital and alive, and that you're in a world that exists with other people, that exists in a place. So that's, I think, what is so compelling to me. throughout all of my work. And the life-size strategy, or using more than one image, or the swings and tilts to lead you through the images, and using photography at all, are really just means to an end that has to do with being human and who we are as humans, what it is to be human, and to be human in a world that has another human in it who looks at it all differently. So, does that answer the question?
Yeah. I would also add, or what's interesting to me is that that strategy was very different from the kinds of photographs that were being made and shown when you began working.
At the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it partly has to do with the notion of photographs being on the wall, which was relatively new, at least, sort of up until the late 1970s.
You mean really thinking of the
wall? Yeah,
wall
the photographs
at the
were
time that I'm
basically made for
shooting.
reproduction. They
Yeah.
were made for monographs.
Yeah.
You were supposed to hold them in your hand, and that was it. And so your strategy was, in terms of activating the viewer and bringing the viewer into the experience, it becomes life-size. It becomes a physical relationship where you have to walk across a series of pictures on the wall or decide where you're going to enter the picture. And that was quite unusual at the time, I have to say.
Right. I remember with the Tricia Brown Company piece, just being very excited about the fact that, and it actually, I was sitting where you're sitting, watching her on this stage. So this is a very interesting moment for me to try to talk about this. But it had to do with, the dancers were talking about the body. And I just read something in Olga Vizo wrote a book about Anna Mendieta. How do you pronounce that? Mendieta, where she quotes Vito Acconci saying, and I may be completely blowing the quotation, but I like this idea, and I think it came from him. But anyway, that the human body is the connecting point between the individual's experience, their emotions, their mental whatever, and the culture. And I think the body just seemed, hearing Wendy Morris, the dancer, and various other people whose bodies were the artwork, talking at Walker, people who came here, Ping Chong, all these people talking about the present tense experience, and Meredith Monk definitely, how the body is the site of the artwork, which really was a new experience for me, and thrilling, just absolutely thrilling to think about that. I think I didn't quite answer your question, but I said something else.
It does, sure.
Okay.
Now we're looking at the swimmers here. This is one of the only series in the show. You mentioned that many of the works that the series that you're working on are overlapping, they're ongoing. You're working on 3 or 4 different projects simultaneously that have very different sort of conceptual bases. And this is one project that I think, Susan, you mentioned in the catalog, JoAnn actually considers finished. It was a series that had a beginning and an end, and very specific parameters in terms of how the photographs were set up and what the swimmers were required to wear, so as not to suggest a specific time or place. And I love your story about how the pictures were actually taken. This was a camera perched very precariously on the edge of the pool, and the swimmers were cold, and nothing was very comfortable for anyone. But I wonder if you can talk a bit about this series and how we're now looking at the body moving from that stark neutral background to something that suggests perhaps another kind of interior or landscape, or the elements in some way.
This isn't answering your question, but I just have to say one of the things that's different about the MoMA show and the show here happened because of the architecture, but it also happened because Siri's idea about organizing the work was to start with a figure with almost no background, because it's a white background, and then it moves into a point where you have this water background, and then into a landscape background with the big piece called Power at the Borders, and then eventually the figure disappears so that you have what I feel is the background for the viewer's experience, as though you've just stepped out of that landscape or someone else has just stepped out of that landscape. It feels very human occupied to me in a way, except the human isn't there anymore. That's how I look at it. I don't know. That's not what you're asking, but I think it relates to what was happening with these pictures. And is there something a little more specific about
No,
the?
I think it's just interesting that how we're looking now at the. I mean, they're staged, and, but in a much looser way, I think. And there is the sense of performance that still is happening with these, with the bodies in motion or at rest or floating.
Right. Part of that had to do with moving from the 11 by 14 camera, which was 5 feet long, in order to make things life-size on the negative, and they were contact printed, so that's how I did them. I had a 5-foot-long table with this 5-foot-long camera on it. In order to focus it, I slid the camera forward and back, and it made a screeching sound, which was great because it made people jump, you know, and it kind of enlivened the situation. And
this was the heads, the first heads.
The heads. Mm-hmm. In order to make the exposure with this old camera, I took the lens cap off, counted 10 seconds, popped a flash, and then put the lens cap back on again. So it was a very, people had to sit still in order to be in focus. Whereas with this was going to, I decided I didn't want to ruin my 8x10 camera, which is this beautiful camera. I would use my 5x7, which was kind of a junky camera, and just if it fell in the water, so be it. Of course, I think back on this, that if it had ever fallen on somebody, and I just think, oh, what an idiot I was. Because I had it was here's the water. It was like this over the water. But I'm glad it looks freer, because it really was not free for those poor people who were lying in the water freezing, and they would get out and they would go, oh, my arm, my shoulder, my leg.
I'm curious, how much did you direct people? I mean, obviously you did.
I drew
for
the
example, in
pictures
this
first.
picture, how much you actually drew
In this
them?
picture, this is a different story, but I drew the pictures first, and that I needed to do that because what would happen is people would get in the water and they'd say, what do you want me to do? And I'd be like, just try some things, and that didn't really work very well. So I had to have an idea to get started so that I wasn't sort of afraid of it, so just to break the ice. And whether or not that picture ended up being reflected in the final photograph depended. In this case, when she got in the water, her hair sat on the water in this amazing, beautiful way. And I said, don't move. And I shot it. So that wasn't from a drawing. That was from seeing something and responding quickly to it. But I had to set the camera.
Did you direct Ricardo to look off or no?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was a different picture.
Well, it still does. The hair does the same thing.
Yeah.
Well, no, this is hair under the water. The other one was sitting on the surface. But this one was directed, I think this was from a drawing. Yeah, this was from a drawing. And it was very slow, and they were very achy when it was over, and thank you very much, my models.
Oh, now we're looking at 3x Jim. So moving into, this is the late 80s, I guess, that Jim sort of entered the scene, right? Or your body of work. Can you talk a bit about how you began to, as you were saying, you go back to the same topic, the subject again and again, and how this began to...
He was in my life, and I considered myself a portrait, someone who wanted to do portraits, wanted to work with people, figurative works with humans in them. And he was the person there, especially when I went on a trip. I am very shy, and I don't like going, asking... I've tried photographing strangers. I hate my photographs of strangers. They're really awful. There's a kind of... anyway... but Jim was there, and he was willing, and he's a performance artist in some ways. He's a writer, but he also has a side of himself that is performative. So it was a nice match, and on our honeymoon, I didn't keep any of the pictures of him. They're not very good. It took me a while to figure out how to work with him in a way that I like, the results. But he's been very cooperative, and he doesn't always want to do it, but he wants to do it enough, and it's been great.
This was the picture.
And I read his poems. It works both ways.
Good. This was the picture that opened the exhibition
at MoMA. Yeah.
Which I think maybe you can address why you chose this particular one and to open the show. It was emblematic of something at large.
To me, it's interesting to think about this picture in relation to the Rephotographic Survey project, where the pictures were made, 103, 104 years apart. I mean, I don't know what the I think you told me that you only made 3 exposures.
Right.
You did not make them in this order.
I don't know which order, because they were in a
Right.
box of film.
Right.
So they were chosen from a group.
But the notion of, I mean, it's all part of a piece. All of the work, it seems to me, in terms of the ideas about time and space. And so the relationship of this to the rephotographic, it's dealing with the same issues, in effect. What else? To me, I write about this, as JoAnn said, I write about this at length in the catalog, but it's one of the, existential is the word that I keep coming up with in relation to it. But it seems to me one of the most intimate pictures I know in all of my looking at photographs. Just because you're there as a kind of voyeur, and you see this person and you're observing them, and there's a slight change from the first to the second picture where it seems as though he's becoming slightly more cognizant of his surroundings. And then, of course, you have the encounter with the viewer in the last. So to me, it's like being on the subway and you're sort of studying someone, and there's that moment where you might meet their eyes, and you have this moment of recognition, and it's tremendously sad to me. Also, it's because it is about the aloneness and our separation from each other, and of course, the work of art attempts to transcend that, to bridge that gap. Anyway, it's just very beautiful. And this is interesting to me because it continues the idea. I mean, it seems to me that the strategy of expanding time, of stretching time, is true in all of the works, whether you bring in the newspapers, so you have a moment that's being described in the photograph, and then you have the newspaper, which is dealing with another event apart from that time. But this is when it's between moments, where you've just arrived and nobody's decided what you're going to do. I mean, I don't know what actually is going on.
It's such a familiar thing, right?
Yeah.
You walk into this hotel room and
what should I do first?
Right.
No, to me, this is actually one of the most cinematic pictures in the show. I mean, and I think the idea of narrative is something that's present in all of your pictures in one way or another.
This is an ongoing discussion.
Yes, we talk
Siri
about
keeps
this.
trying to say their narrative, and I say, what
Well,
narrative?
I think the
come
show
up
in
with
itself
come
is a
up with
narrative
very
in a
good
way,
answers.
but this one in particular, I do sense that yearning for some story behind.
There's a story,
and there's right, and some of
Of course,
these
that's
more-
what's so seductive about the picture.
Absolutely.
It's like, what's going to happen?
Exactly.
Where were they? What's going on in that room?
People have asked me, oh, is that your apartment? And I said, yikes. No, our switches are actually...
Who's your electrician? These are a few, actually, some of the first color still lifes. Really,
Yes.
And there's
that
a
we're
very
looking at.
practical reason you stopped working in black and white, which has to do with
What
not
was
being
that?
able to work in the darkroom.
Yes, because I got pneumonia, and I had to stop. It was horrible. Yeah, so I just did color for a while. I had been doing both for a few years, and then I had to stop doing black and white. It was really bad.
But it turned out very good.
Thank you.
Not all these artistic decisions are made for, lofty aesthetic reasons, but
Right,
rather
right. That's
the
so
real
true.
world.
That's so true.
especially in photography.
This is 3 Times Jim behind us from 1991, and
No, this is
Still-
still.
I'm sorry,
yeah.
Still Life with Jim from 1991. And this is, to me, a really important picture in the show for a lot of reasons, but I think the sense of the still life and the portrait merging completely in a picture is something that's happening here. And I'm wondering if you could talk about what was happening
definitely
there.
was thinking about that. I was thinking about making, Matisse is a really good model for this. I was thinking about still lives that look like portraits, portraits that look like still lives, how you could just use what's strong about one or the other when your subject matter is, what would be typically used. In fact, there was an earlier version of a picture of Jim lying on a bed that was called Still Life with Head. And I thought it was probably a measure of my growth as a human being that I abandoned that picture for Still Life with Jim. That I wasn't just using him as this object in my still life, but
it's a
actually
still life
letting
with
him
Jim.
Yeah,
That's right. Yeah.
having a person be a person.
And I think there are so many references in here to painting, and in a lot of ways, I think so many of these photographs, these early color ones in particular, have a very lush painterly quality. Marvin and Maurice, another picture in the show. How much composing is happening in terms of the color and what you're choosing?
I don't remember if I did this with this picture. The color, yes, definitely. I thought about the fact that the white sheets would go to cyan. I was using a long exposure, and what happens with color film if you shoot with an exposure that's more than, say, a second, and I think these were probably at least that long or longer, then the white goes to blue, this blue cyan color, sort of a swimming pool blue color. And I knew that would happen, and I knew that I liked that because I love Cézanne still lifes that have this incredibly beautiful blue with the fruit. And so that was definitely a conscious choice to use the long exposure rather than a shorter exposure, which would have been totally different color-wise. And in terms of the composition, I don't know if I did it with this one, but I oftentimes draw the images with a piece of tracing paper, or originally it was just airmail stationery, and then I can line it up when I'm shooting the next picture. I can actually hold the first drawing up next to the ground glass when I'm under the dark cloth, so I can see how certain things stretch and twist and torque in interesting dynamic ways, hopefully. And he fell asleep. And I had one of the legs of the tripod on the bed, and he still fell asleep. He's a champion sleeper.
Well, talk about the sleeping, and that is a particular topic, or that moment that you've been capturing.
I don't know what I can say about that. I do think it's a little bit like some of these other devices, like the reflection or the newspaper. You know, this doubling of reality. There is a way in which a sleeper suggests another reality, which is what the surrealists, of course, worked with, this idea of the dream being referred to in an artwork, so that there's, you know, his body is there, but you can assume that his mind is somewhere other than yours as the viewer, that his mind, and again, it goes back to this idea of the music lesson, that there's a parallel thing happening, that you're looking at him, or that you're looking at a music lesson in Vermeer's case, and that you're looking at a photograph, but his dreaming, to me, suggests, like the newspaper suggests, something that's going on in the Sudan. His dream, the fact that his eyes are closed and his face is so relaxed and he looks like he's asleep, suggests that there's something else going on. So it's, again, this doubling of reality, which is what the photograph is also doing. Because you're in the gallery. That's the other reality. You're there. Your body is standing there looking at it. And that's part of what I'm counting on with these pictures. I'm not assuming that they're going to be just in a dark tube somewhere.
So Susan, you at MoMA, these were gathered together. This is an installation photograph from the Museum of Modern Art this past summer, and it's a really compelling installation like this. I think we've chosen to do it here at the Walker as well. And how did the two of you come up with this particular strategy for hanging them?
That's a good question.
I mean, I think it's a fascinating. Like you mentioned to me once, this idea that, you know, one life-size object in one picture could travel to the next object, or the hand in one picture could pick up something. Yeah. And they all start to
because of
to
the
speak
scale
to each other
being
in some way.
All the way through, there's a sense. I want there to be a sense that they all live in the same world. But yeah, tell the truth.
The truth is that the work that I had selected, and you make these little chips that you saw on some of JoAnn's slides. Broke down into series, the swimmers series, you had the serial portraits, the early pictures. So everything broke down into these nice series. And then suddenly we came to the color work. And we had all these chips together on the table. And I had this big wall. And I sat there and I thought, well, what would happen if we just kind of put them all together? And it's so wonderful, especially working with someone that I think we trust each other. But actually I was a little nervous, and I thought, well, she's really not going to like this. And I sort of glommed a little group of them together, and I said, well, what if we just put them all together?
And I said all or nothing.
Right, and that's what we ended up doing, and I think it absolutely works. I mean, it is all of a piece. I mean, they aren't all of Jim, but they're all of that kind of intimate, often domestic, very close, very sensuous, physical kind
Your
of.
view from
Yeah.
the wall.
Yeah. So that's how that
Yeah.
worked itself out. Yep.
And we want to be able to ask, we're at 9:05, so we should let some people ask questions, perhaps. Let's all ask questions. We can see you all, I think. I have a few more images we can just kind of flip through as we're talking, but I want to make sure you all have a chance to ask what you want to ask. And there are ushers with microphones, as Sarah mentioned, if any of you want to raise your hands and make yourselves visible. There's someone over here.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
I wondered if you ever your stereoscopic photographs and if you could comment on the difference between the stereoscopic and the monocular photographs in terms of the space and time.
I love them, but I haven't because I think it's such a frustrating, weak experience to come across relative to what I'm going to say in a minute, to come across a stereo image in a gallery. It just doesn't cut it. What I loved about shooting these stereo pictures, does everybody know what a stereo picture is? If in the old days, there were a lot of different techniques to make them, but what you end up with is a photograph that's taken from a position this far away from another photograph. And when you put it in a stereo, what's called a stereo viewer, you actually see the image in stereo. So some things are in the foreground and other things in the background. They were very popular in the 19th century as travel images, because you take a picture of a mountain with somebody standing in front of it, and it actually looked like the guy pops out right in the foreground, and the mountain's way in the background, and you feel like you're there. You're looking through this little viewer, which is a thrilling experience. I love it. However, what I was trying to do with it was I like the idea of these twin images, almost like Diane Arbus's twins. Just twin images appealed to me. But it wasn't enough. What I really loved was that it was transformed when you put it into the stereo viewer. And specifically what I was doing was I was shooting things where you couldn't tell what was happening in the three-dimensional version until you put it in the stereo viewer. So although I like the way they look as two pictures seated next to each other, I really like what happens when you're completely surprised. I mean, you just gasp. For example, the one that I think was the most successful, there was somebody's backyard, and it was typical of that period, the new topographic style, very loose composition. But then when you put it in the viewer, it turns out that you can't see it for some reason. It just blends into the background. There's a clothesline going from the back of the space to the foreground of the space, and you almost feel like you're going to be hit by it. It's so shocking that it exists, and you really don't see it when you look at the two pictures. And it had colored clothespins on the line. So it's that transformation where, what is it? I guess just entering an image, you're rewarded with your world it's that metaphor of the world getting bigger, and that you think you know, but then something happens and you discover you didn't know, and something's added to your life, added to your experience. It's that as a metaphor that was the most powerful thing to me about the stereos. So I show them to people personally, in the lab, but I haven't shown them, and I wouldn't show them in a gallery setting. It just doesn't make sense.
Other questions?
Yeah, I'm wondering, over here.
Oh, hello.
I'm wondering what the sleep means to you, if it means anything, or if it's just a handy subject that's still, or if it's come to mean something. Or
yeah, it does, but I don't know what. It was first a handy subject, definitely. And I know that I find myself drawing details from Italian paintings where you've got, Christ is getting out of the tomb, and to the side there are these soldiers who have fallen asleep. And there'll be a way that the body has flopped that I find totally appealing. And I'll find myself drawing these things. But I think it's also what I was talking about before, that sleep in and of itself implies another reality is there, consistent with, in the same time with, in the same space with the reality that you're conscious of or that you're acknowledging. So it's that sense of the reality that exists and you know about it, but you don't know what it is. You know, it's, if I were a poet, I could probably say it in words. I can't, I don't know. If I tried a few times, maybe I could do better. But I mean, I can only kind of give you the stars and the constellation. I can't give you the whole image.
Another one? Anyone? We have time for a couple more. Over here.
Hi, JoAnn. I'm curious how you, do you stay true to using traditional film and traditional old cameras like large format? How much does modern technology and digital manipulation through Photoshop and printing processes, does any of that come into your work at all? And how do you feel about maybe the two camps, like maybe what's happened with technology? And how
I don't think there have to be two camps. But the biggest effect that the digital explosion has had on me is that my film was discontinued. So I have a certain number of boxes of color film left, and then that's it. I'm going to have to figure out another way to work besides the 5x7, which I'm not expecting will be a problem, but on the other hand, I don't know what I'm going to be doing. So that's one answer. In this show, the only digital images are the two, or digitally manipulated, I should say, images are the two sand pyramids. I'm not counting the videos, which are both...
Show you those.
Yeah, one is a digital video, the other was originally Super 8 film that was transferred just for the convenience of the exhibition, and because you can't transfer them anymore, the film doesn't exist. But those were manipulated after they were shot. So they started out as sculpture, and that was what I studied, by the way, in school. Then they were transferred onto film, so they were straight photographs. Then they were scanned and run into my computer, where I was essentially drawing, which is fun. I love drawing. And then they were turned into digital files that were sent to a photo lab and made into straight photographs. So it's this, I really like that process, going back and forth like that. It was a lot of fun. So I don't see them as in competition so much, except that film is less available. But just really that there are new materials out there to be used. The thing is to figure out what the appropriate materials are for what it is you want to do, and not feel that you have to do one thing or another just because that's what's being sold at the store, but rather find the right materials for what you want to do.
JoAnn, this is a beautiful show and a great talk.
Thank you.
I just wanted to kind of make a comment about the one comparison you made in the earlier just talk that you did about Vermeer time, and tie that back into into the concept of voyeurism with a photograph, and also the discussion on the radio today about this kind of, there was a big discussion on the radio today about reality being a part of the photograph. And the comment I have is just that your photographs, the way you place the subject in proximity to the front surface of the print, and the fact that they're still lifes, that's what you seem to have brought to the photograph, or rather to the viewer, is this kind of opportunity, not so much as a voyeur, but this opportunity through a still life to really kind of experience and be a part of that individual's or get close to that individual through that proximity. And I think that's probably one of the things that's so interesting about these photographs. And I've seen, I haven't seen all of the shows back to the 80s, but I've seen some of the first Bank show, and that was kind of what hit me then. But I didn't understand I didn't get it until now. It's really wonderful.
Thank you very much for your comment. I know that one of the things that has been important to me with the still lives, with all the work, is that when you're looking at it, that you lose track of where the air in the image ends and the air in the space where you're standing begins. That you're not, yeah.
I think we have time for one more, probably. Last question. Who wants to ask it? Anyone? Okay.
Could I make one more comment?
Yes.
I really, really appreciate this community, and there are fabulous artists in this community who are bright, brilliant, provocative in every medium, and I so appreciate you in my life and the other people in the art world who have contributed so much and continue to contribute so much, and thank you very, very much for being part of my life and part of the life of this community. We are all in it together, and I feel so lucky to have you in my life.
Thank you all so much.